The morning of the reading was the kind of morning that reminded Eleanor of what she was. The carriages began arriving before 9. She watched from the back passage window, the one that looked out over the forecourt through a crescent of old yew, because the front rooms were not, strictly speaking, hers to occupy. 3 coaches in an hour, each one a declaration. Lady Cornelia's came first, with its black velvet curtains half drawn, and a footman who jumped down before the wheels stopped. Philip Rowe's hired postchaise followed behind it. Mud on the panels, a valise flung out without ceremony. And then last a plain, dark traveling carriage with a single crest she did not recognize, which stopped very precisely at the bottom of the steps, as though the driver had been told to make no impression. The man who stepped out of the plain carriage was not plain. He was tall and spare, dressed in a dark coat, a white cravat pressed and exact, and he stood for a moment at the foot of the steps looking up at the house, with an expression she could not read from the distance. Then he turned and looked briefly toward the yew passage. She stepped back from the glass. She did not know if he had seen her. She told herself it did not matter. He was Miles Ashford, Earl of Sedbourne, Sir Gerald Vane's solicitor, and the executor of the estate, a man whose function today was procedural, and whose attention, if he had any, would be directed at the documents in the leather case his clerk carried behind him. He had been to Eldon Hall twice in the past 2 years on legal business. On neither occasion had he spoken to her beyond what was required by courtesy. He was the law's representative, measured and contained, and she was the woman in the yew passage who had no particular claim on any room she was about to enter. She pressed her father's small leather ledger into the pocket of her gown and went to help Mrs. Dallow with the luncheon arrangements, because that was what she was here to do. Eleanor Vane had come to Eldon Hall 26 months ago with £40, a dress box, and the kind of composed face that women learn when they need to arrive somewhere and make it look like a choice. Her father, George Vane, had been Sir Gerald's younger brother, the one who had married a merchant's daughter in 1800 and been quietly removed from the family's conversational ledger for the next 2 decades. He'd been a good man. Her father. He had been careful with money and careful with his daughter, and he had taught her to keep accounts at the kitchen table on Thursday evenings when the week's figures were in, and he had died of a fever in the spring of 1814 and left her with debts that were not large but were, given the absence of any other resource, very precisely ruinous. Sir Gerald had written to her. The letter was formal and brief. It offered her a position at Eldon Hall not as a servant and not quite as a relation, but as something in between, a companion to no one in particular, a pair of educated hands for the correspondence, a woman of reasonable address who could be called upon to manage small tasks that were above the housekeeper's station. He did not use the word charity. He was too careful for that. They both knew what it was, and she had come because she had nowhere else to go, and she had worked and she had been useful, and Eldon Hall had become, in the way that a house can become something without quite becoming home, the place where she lived. She had not expected to be loved by it. She had not been. Lady Cornelia Rowe arrived every summer with the certainty of weather, and she managed the house during those months with an efficiency that owed nothing to warmth. She was not cruel to Eleanor in the way that novels describe cruelty. She did not raise her voice. She did not demean. What she did was more precise. She arranged the social furniture of any room so that Eleanor was consistently outside the circle of it, too close to be invisible and too distant to be addressed, a woman neither guest nor servant, occupying the particular purgatory that English country houses reserve for those whose blood is correct, but whose fortune is not. That first August in the morning room, Lady Cornelia had received Miss Eugenia Palliser, a composed and beautifully dressed young woman who had come to visit with the bright, contained attention of someone who has been told to look carefully at what is available. Lady Cornelia had gestured briefly toward the passage where Eleanor was carrying a tray of correspondence. "Pay her no mind," Lady Cornelia said. "She is only the poor relation." Miss Palliser had glanced and then looked away, in the manner of someone who has filed an observation and moved on. Eleanor had carried the tray to Sir Gerald's study and set it down, and stood for a moment with her hands flat on the table, looking at nothing in particular. Then she had sorted the correspondence, as she always did, by urgency and by date, and gone back to work, because the work was what remained after everything else was removed. Sir Gerald himself had been, in those last months, a different matter. He was 73. And the summer before his death, he had stopped trying to pretend the cough was seasonal. He had remained at Eldon Hall through the autumn, while the rest of the family removed to London, and Eleanor had remained with him because she had no London to remove to. She had read to him in the evenings from the volumes he chose, Gibbon and Cowper, and the occasional letter from an old correspondent in Edinburgh, and she had managed the correspondence, and when he grew too weak for the stairs, sat in the chair beside his bed, and done the household accounts while he slept. She had not done it because she expected anything from it. She had done it because he was old and in pain, and she was there. And the doing of it was simply what was required of a person who had not yet learned to look away from what was required. On the last morning he was fully conscious. He had taken the small ledger from the table beside him, her father's ledger that she had lent him to show him something about the estate's drainage figures, and pressed it into her hands. "Your father's figures were always sound," he said. His voice was very thin by then. She had thanked him, and taken the ledger and gone to sit in the corridor and collect herself, because she had been with him long enough by then to know that when a man like Sir Gerald said something very quietly and very deliberately, it was worth collecting yourself over. She had not known those were nearly his last coherent words to her. She had not known they were a kind of testament. She had not known, because she had not the least suspicion of it, that the night before he pressed her father's ledger into her hands, Sir Gerald had summoned his solicitor by an express letter and added a codicil to his will. She had known none of it. She had only kept the ledger because it had been her father's, and because Sir Gerald had held it, and because some things you carry without knowing why, the way you carry a person's voice in your chest long after the person is gone. The reading was convened at 2 o'clock in the estate's long drawing room, which had been rearranged with chairs facing a writing table, and which smelled of the candles Mrs. Dallow had lit against the November chill. Eleanor sat in the back row. She had been told to attend, which had surprised her. She had assumed her presence was administrative, a matter of being on hand should anyone require anything. The room held 14 people. Lady Cornelia in the front center chair, dressed in a deep gray that was not quite mourning, but was close enough to convey appropriate feeling. Philip to her left, with his large hands folded on his knees, and the expression of a man who has been told to wait and who finds waiting beneath him. Miss Palliser to his left, her gloves in her lap, her profile exactly arranged. 2 of Sir Gerald's cousins from Berkshire, a pair of quiet men with the look of people who have come a long way and hope to be home before dark. A neighbor, Sir Edmund Gale, who had been a friend of Sir Gerald's since before the century turned. 3 servants who had long service and therefore under the terms Sir Gerald had discussed with the household. The right to be present. A junior clerk Eleanor did not know. And at the writing table, the leather case open before him, his face entirely composed, was the solicitor. He began at 2 o'clock precisely. His voice carried without effort, the voice of a man accustomed to rooms that need to hear him, and the words of the first document fell into the afternoon light with the measured weight of things that cannot be taken back. The estate's principal trust held in Lady Cornelia's name pending the arrangement of Philip's marriage to a named candidate of suitable standing. The townhouse in Bath, furnished. The investment holdings, to be managed by the family's bank, under the direction of Lady Cornelia's own solicitor. It was a generous settlement, orderly and complete, and Lady Cornelia's hands relaxed in her lap as each provision confirmed what she had been told to expect. Philip exhaled through his nose a small sound of settled satisfaction. Then he paused. He did not pause, for effect. He paused in the way of a man who has found something he was not entirely expecting and who is deciding, with professional precision, how to proceed. He looked at the document before him. He set it down. He took from the leather case a second, narrower envelope, sealed with a different wax, and he looked at it for a moment without expression. "I must request a brief recess," he said. "A quarter of an hour. I ask that the principals remain." Lady Cornelia's chin lifted a fraction. Is there some difficulty? There is a secondary document which I had not previously examined in full. I will return shortly. He looked then at Eleanor in the back row. Miss Vane, he said, his voice level, I should be grateful if you would remain as well. She did not know why he asked. She stayed. The book room was on the west side of the house. A smaller room, lined, floor to ceiling with Sir Gerald's correspondence files and account ledgers, which Eleanor had spent 4 months organizing into something approaching coherent order. He entered without ceremony and set the narrow envelope down on the central table and stood for a moment looking around at the shelving. Eleanor had followed at a distance, uncertain of her purpose. She had brought Sir Gerald's household ledger with her, the one she had meant to return to its shelf, and she set it in its place, on the second shelf from the left, between the accounts for 1811 and 1813. She was reaching for the 1814 volume when she heard him stop moving. She did not turn around immediately. She pressed the ledger into its place, straightened its spine, and smoothed the edge with her thumb, as she always did. Then she turned and found him standing very still, watching her. "These are Sir Gerald's papers," he said. "Yes, my lord. You organized them." It was not a question, and she answered it as a statement deserved to be answered. "Over the course of last winter and spring, Sir Gerald asked me to. The correspondence had not been sorted since 1809, and the account files were in several different locations, which made the year-end reconciliation difficult. I reorganized them by year, with a contents notation at the front of each folder." He looked at the shelving for a long moment. The spines were lettered in her hand, clear and small, each date exact, each folder tabbed with a strip of paper and a notation of the folder's contents. The room was quiet around them. The only sound, the distant voices from the drawing room down the corridor and the small settling of a coal in the fireplace that Eleanor had laid that morning, as she always laid it, because someone had to. There was nothing unusual about the filing to her. It was simply the work she had been given, done as carefully as she knew how. She had done it in the evenings mostly, when the household was settled, and there was no one to require anything of her, and she had found the work steadying, in the way that putting things in order is steadying, regardless of whether the things are yours. You learned when nothing was yours to take a quiet satisfaction in exactness, in the columns that balanced, in the folders that held what they said they held. She was not aware of him watching her until she turned. She was not aware in that moment of what her own face had done while she straightened the ledger spine, whether any of it had shown the small private pleasure of the work correctly finished, the unconscious settling she felt whenever something was placed correctly and could be left alone. "The secondary codicil," he said very carefully, "references a document ledger maintained by Miss Vane against the estate's amended accounts. I had assumed that was a historical reference. It refers to these." "I did not know that," she said. "No," he said. He looked at her for the first time without the professional distance she had always felt from him, and beneath it she could not quite read what was there. "I imagine you did not." He opened the secondary envelope and read it through, alone, while she stood at the shelving, and did not pretend to do anything else. When he had finished, he set it down and was quiet for long enough that she looked at him again. And what she saw in his face was the particular stillness of a man who has found exactly what he suspected and is considering how to carry it correctly. "You should know," he said, "that what I have found is legal, registered, and not subject to contest on procedural grounds. I wish you to understand that before we return to the drawing room." She understood that he was telling her something significant. She did not yet understand what. He crossed to the door and held it open. She preceded him into the corridor. She had gone perhaps 3 steps when his leather case shifted on the table behind her and caught the flap of his coat as he closed it. Something small and dark fell to the floor. She turned. He was already moving toward it, and she was closer, and she picked it up before he reached it, and found herself holding a small framed portrait, oval, fitted with an ivory backing, the image of a woman with dark eyes and a serious, thoughtful mouth. She held it out to him immediately, not looking at it again. He took it, his hand covering hers for less than a second, and slid it back into his pocket. His face was entirely still. "Forgive me," she said, because she felt she had intruded on something not meant to be seen. "There is nothing to forgive," he said. The words were correct, and his voice was level, and they told her nothing. As they walked back along the corridor, she noticed that his hand had gone to the pocket where the portrait rested. Briefly, and then away. She thought about a man who carries something for so long that the carrying has become invisible even to himself. She thought about the particular weight of grief that does not declare itself. She told herself she was only observing it, as she observed everything in this house that was not precisely her own. If you have waited for a verdict already written, if you have ever sat in a room and felt the air change before anyone has spoken, stay close to this story. What comes next is the part Sir Gerald intended all along. The drawing room was quieter when they returned to it, the way rooms go quiet when people have been talking and have stopped at a door opening. Lady Cornelia had moved her chair very slightly toward the center. Philip had produced a new expression, something between confidence and patience. Miss Pallister had her gloves folded on her knee with the tidiness of someone who expects to leave soon. He returned to the writing table without hurry. He set the secondary envelope before him. He set nothing else down. He looked at the assembled room with the same quality of composed attention he had brought to the first document, and Eleanor sat in the back row and watched him and waited with the same patience she had brought to everything in this house. "I have identified a secondary codicil to Sir Gerald Vane's testament," he said, "appended and registered with the county record at Eldon Wells on the 22nd of October of this year. It is legally complete, witnessed by Mr. Trats, Tau Coates of my chambers, and by Sir Gerald's physician, Dr. Halkett. The registration precedes Sir Gerald's death by 11 days. Lady Cornelia's fan opened one small, sharp movement. "I was not informed of any codicil. It was registered independently of the primary document which the statute permits. The clause was not communicated to the family by Sir Gerald's explicit instruction until the reading." "What does it say?" Philip said. He looked at the document and read aloud in the same measured voice, and the words fell precisely, one after the other, into the room's considerable silence. The clause was not long. Sir Gerald Vane, being of sound mind and deliberately considered purpose, directed that the house and primary grounds of Eldon Hall, together with the estate's productive farmland and standing accounts, were to pass in full and immediate fee simple to his niece, Miss Eleanor Vane, daughter of his late brother George. In recognition of faithful and particular service to the estate and to Sir Gerald personally, in the final 26 months of his life, and in recognition of her sound management of the estate's domestic accounts, which had been conducted with the diligence and accuracy of a person acting from duty rather than from expectation of reward. The room did not speak. Lady Cornelia's fan had stopped. Then Philip Rowe said, loudly enough to be heard by the cousins from Berkshire, "Surely not the poor relation." Miles Ashford looked up from the document. He looked at Philip with an expression that contained in its perfect professional stillness something that was not professional at all. He set the document down. "Miss Vane is the sole inheritor. The estate is hers." 12 words, spoken without volume, spoken as a statement of fact that required no elaboration and would permit no revision. The room heard them. Lady Cornelia's fan went absolutely still. Mr. Coates came forward from the side of the room with a separate document under his arm. The county registration ledger, which he set on the writing table and opened to the entry dated the 22nd of October. The entry was there, in the precise, clear hand of the county registrar, with 2 witnesses' signatures beside it. It was not a copy. It was the original registration held in trust by the solicitor's chambers, precisely because Sir Gerald had understood that his primary family would not welcome the codicil, and had taken the precaution of ensuring it could not be contested on grounds of forgery or irregularity. Lady Cornelia stood. She was a woman who had spent 30 years in rooms like this one, managing their social temperature with the skill of someone who has never needed to raise her voice to be obeyed. And she brought all of that skill to bear now on a face that showed nothing except a cold and careful composure. "I shall require my own solicitor to review the registration," she said. "You are entitled to do so," he said. "He will confirm what Mr. Coates has placed before you. The registration is unimpeachable." There was a silence in which the room recalibrated slowly, like a compass finding north. Sir Edmund Gale, in the left side chair, straightened almost imperceptibly. The cousins from Berkshire exchanged a glance, and then the elder of the two turned to look at Eleanor in the back row with an expression she had not seen directed at herself in that room before. "Mrs." Dallow, standing in the doorway, put one hand to her collar and pressed her lips together, and Eleanor could see from where she sat that the housekeeper's eyes had gone very bright. One of the long-service servants, Harwick the head footman, who had been with Sir Gerald for 23 years, took a step back from the wall where he stood and then stopped himself, and stood very straight and still, which was the Eldon Hall equivalent of an ovation. Miss Pallister rose from her chair with the smoothness of someone who has learned to exit gracefully when a room changes its meaning. She stood beside Philip and she said, in a tone low enough for the household to hear, at the threshold but not quite loud enough for the room to formally receive it, and she said, simply, "To think they left it to the poor relation." The words were not addressed to anyone in particular. They were simply released into the air of the corridor, like something discarded, and landed there without catching, because the room had already moved past them. Lady Cornelia collected her gloves from the chair arm. She moved with exactitude, each motion deliberate, her face holding the composed authority that had served her in 30 years of rooms like this. And she looked at Eleanor directly, for the first time since the reading had begun. Eleanor looked back at her. Neither of them spoke. What passed between them was not animosity. It was, Eleanor thought, something closer to recognition. A woman who had organized her entire life around the social order she had been given, looking at a woman who had organized her life around doing what was in front of her to do, and discovering for the first time that the second arrangement had proved the more durable. Lady Cornelia inclined her head, a small, precise motion that was neither acknowledgment nor concession, but simply a withdrawal from the field, and she walked out, and Philip followed, and Miss Pallister's skirts whispered behind them. The room exhaled. Sir Edmund Gale rose and came to Eleanor, and said quietly and with more warmth than she had expected, "Your uncle was a man of considerable foresight." He bowed, and left Mrs. Dallow found Eleanor in the passage an hour later, when the Roses' carriages had gone down the drive, and the drawing-room held nothing but the settling afternoon light and the solicitor at his papers. "Miss Pallister was heard at the landing before she left," Mrs. Dallow said. "I thought you should know." "I know," Eleanor said. She had heard it. It had landed in the way that familiar words land when they arrive one time too many, not as a wound but as the last voicing of a misreading that was no longer operative, a description of something that had ceased to be true while the speaker was still certain of it. The label was not new to her. What was new was that it no longer described her legal situation, which made it only a description of other people's error, which was a different thing entirely. Yet she was not certain she believed it. Not entirely. Lady Cornelia had said there would be a solicitor. The clause had seemed real, and the voice that read it had held nothing she could read, as doubt and the county registration had been open on the table for the room to see. She knew very little about legal proceedings, and she knew even less about what it meant to defend an inheritance against a woman with Lady Cornelia's connections and Lady Cornelia's certainty. The house was around her, solid and cold and familiar, and it had been around her for 26 months without belonging to her, and she was not yet certain that the difference between those two states was as clean as the document suggested. She sat in her small room on the upper floor, the pocket ledger in her hands. She turned it over and looked at the cover, at the wear at the corners where her father had held it on Thursday evenings when the week's figures were in. The room was cold. She had not lit the fire, and the afternoon had gone gray outside the window, and the cold settled against her back through the plain wool of her gown. She did not move to light it. She sat with the ledger in her lap and let the cold be there. She thought about the drainage figures she had shown Sir Gerald in the last autumn. The ones her father had recorded. The careful account of what the Eastfields cost and what they yielded, and how the margin could be improved if the ditch were cleared at the proper time. She thought about Sir Gerald's hands on the ledger as he looked at the figures, the particular stillness of a man who is recognizing something he had hoped to see, something that confirms what he already suspected about a person but had not yet been able to put in writing. She thought about his voice, very thin, saying that her father's figures were always sound. She had not understood it then as a bequest. She had understood it as an old man's gentleness, an expression of affection toward a niece who is useful and present, which was perhaps the most she had thought herself capable of inspiring. She had been told in enough ways over enough years that she was precisely that, useful and present, manageable. A problem someone had already found a practical solution for, that the telling had become the truth she carried. She carried it now with the ledger in her hands, and she thought about Lady Cornelia's voice that afternoon saying she should begin to consider her next position. And she thought about Miss Pallister's words at the landing. And she thought about the county registration ledger open on the drawing-room table, the entry in the registrar's clear hand. And she thought about a solicitor's voice saying 12 words in a room that had gone entirely silent. Perhaps he had always intended it. Perhaps the work she had done quietly, in the evenings without knowing anyone was watching, had been watched by the one person in the house whose watching would carry legal weight. She set the ledger on the table and went to the window and watched the last light on the eastern fields. If this story is moving in your chest, if you can feel the weight of a house not yet claimed, stay close. The accounting is not finished. The drawing room was nearly dark when she came back down. The solicitor was still at the writing table, the case now shut, the papers ordered, a single candle burning against the early evening. He looked up when she entered. "Lady Cornelia will challenge it," Eleanor said. She was not asking. "She will try," he said. "Her solicitor will advise her that the registration closes that avenue." The independent registration was Sir Gerald's specific precaution against exactly this. He anticipated the challenge. He said nothing to me. He would not have. The codicil's value lay precisely in its surprise. Had he told you, the family would have learned of it, and the challenge would have been mounted before his death rather than after, which would have been both more difficult and more unpleasant for you. He paused. He was protecting you. He had been thinking about this for some time. She thought about this. She thought about Sir Gerald in those last weeks, the ledger pressed into her hands, his voice thin and deliberate, the words chosen as carefully as he had chosen everything. "He protected me," she said. "He did." He stood and crossed to her side of the table. He held out the estate papers, a bundle secured with ribbon, the top document bearing the county's registration stamp. She crossed the room and took them. His fingers released the ribbon as her hands closed on it, and she felt the deliberateness of the transfer, the weight of the papers, the particular gravity of objects that have ceased to belong to one person and have become another's entirely. "I will return in 3 weeks," he said, "to review the estate's accounts and to advise on the transition. The farmland contracts will need renewal in January. There are 3 leases on the eastern lots that should be renegotiated, and the drainage situation on the east field requires attention before the spring. I believe I can manage the accounts," she said. He looked at her for a moment with the quality of attention she had first noticed through the yew window. That morning, the quality that was not only professional. "I know," he said. His voice was level, the words plain, and they carried in their plainness the full weight of what she had not expected from anyone in that house. He took his coat from the chair beside the writing table, picked up the leather case, and left. She stood alone in the drawing room, with the estate papers in her hands and the candle burning on the table, and looked at nothing for a long time. Then she went to the window and looked out at the fields in the last of the light, and they looked, from the window, exactly as they had always looked, and precisely, for the first time, like hers. 3 weeks later, on a gray Thursday morning in December, the plain, dark traveling carriage, came down the drive again. She was in the book room when she heard the wheels on the gravel, going through the farmland contracts with the methodical attention that had become, over the past weeks, not only a task, but a way of understanding that what she held was real, that the legal fact of it was not going to dissolve in the night like something dreamed. He was not alone. The boy was 3 years old, small for his age in a long coat that had been recently let out at the hem. And he held his father's hand with the gravity of a child who has learned that the world is large and his father's hand is reliable. He had his father's dark hair, and Eleanor saw when she came into the entrance hall to receive them, something else in his face. The dark eyes and the serious mouth of a woman in an oval portrait. She crouched down to his height and said, "Good morning," and Thomas regarded her with the solemn consideration of a very small person deciding whether a new adult is trustworthy. "You have many books," he said, because he had looked through the bookroom door. "I do," she said. "They were my uncle's. May I see them?" She showed him the shelves, while he set his case on the table and opened it to the farmland contracts without preamble. She let Thomas pull down the volumes from the lower shelf one at a time, and he opened each one with a carefulness that she recognized as learned from his father, and looked at the pages with the serious consideration of a child who has not yet learned to pretend attention. After a time, he found the pocket ledger on Eleanor's desk. "What is this?" "That was my father's," she said. Thomas looked at the columns of figures. He said, "Did he write all these numbers?" "He did. Are they right?" She looked at the columns, at her father's careful hand, at the years of Thursday evenings written into the fabric of the thing. "Yes," she said. "They are all right." Thomas set the ledger down with deliberate care, the care of a child who has been taught that things which belong to people matter even when they are small, and he went back to the shelf and pulled down another volume. Eleanor watched him for a moment, and the particular tenderness of watching a child be careful with something fragile moved through her in a wave she had not expected. She looked up and found him standing in the doorway of the bookroom, his coat half removed, watching her with Thomas. She did not know how long he had been there. She returned to the farmland contracts at the table. He came and stood beside her, and they worked through them together, his voice precise and measured, hers occasionally questioning, occasionally offering an observation from the estate's own history that made him pause, and look at the page again with the attention of a man reconsidering what he thought he had already settled. The January renewals took the better part of an hour. The East Lot leases took another 40 minutes, and she produced her father's ledger at one point to show him the drainage figures, and he looked at the page in silence, and then said that Sir Gerald had been correct to trust her judgment on the eastern field. By 4 o'clock, Thomas was asleep on the window seat, with his coat folded under his head. He looked at his son for a long moment, the way a man looks at something he has not permitted himself to look at directly, for a long time. Then he sat down in the chair across the table from Eleanor and said, without preamble, her name was Frances. Eleanor set down her pen. "She died in October of 1811, he said. "I was in London. I had been advised by her physician that there was time that the confinement was going well, and I remained in London for a client's matter that I believed at the time could not be postponed. I have thought, in the years since, that it could have been postponed. I am now certain of it." He looked at the table at his own hands. "I came back and found Thomas, and Frances was gone. He does not remember her. He is old enough now to notice that other children have mothers. I have not known what to do with that." Eleanor looked at the oval portrait that lived in his pocket, at the precise shape of the absence it described. "She looks kind," she said. She was. She was also impatient, and very funny, and she could not abide sentimentality of any kind. She would have thought that my carrying her portrait in my coat pocket for 4 years was excessive, and said so directly. The word almost reached Eleanor's mouth before she caught it. "You carry it because you needed to," she said instead. He looked at her. There was something in the air of the room that had not been there before. Something settled and changed. He reached into his coat and took out the oval portrait and held it for a moment, looking at it, really looking at it, the first time she had seen him do so. Then he stood and crossed to the mantel above the fireplace and set the portrait there, upright, facing the room. Not placed facing the wall, not put away. Set where the candlelight could reach it, and where Thomas, when he woke, would be able to see his mother's face. Eleanor watched him do this. She felt something in the room settle into a new arrangement, like figures in an account that have finally been reconciled. He came back to the table. He did not sit. He stood beside her chair, looking at the contract papers still spread across the desk, and she was very aware of the nearness of him, the warmth of it, the particular quality of stillness that surrounds two people who have been moving toward a truth for longer than either of them has formally acknowledged. She was aware of his hand near hers on the desk. She was aware of the distance between them and the size of that distance, which was small. "Eleanor," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. He said it the way he said everything, in the same level voice, but it was not a procedural statement, and neither of them pretended otherwise. She reached for his hand where it rested beside her papers, and she laid her own hand over it. He turned his palm and closed his fingers around hers with the steadiness of a man who has decided something and intends the decision to be understood as final. It was not a declaration. It was not a speech. It was a hand and another hand, and the simple fact of pressure held. She thought of her father's ledger on the desk, and the accounts kept correctly, and Sir Gerald's voice saying the figures were sound, and all the evenings she had sat in this room or one like it and done the work because it was there to do, without knowing she was being watched, without knowing that being watched was the same, sometimes, as being known. They were still for a long moment. Thomas slept on the fire, settled and sent up a small, bright scatter, and the room was warm. Outside the bookroom window, the first snow of December fell past the glass, slow and even and very soft, covering the eastern fields and the long drive and the yew passage and all of it, everything, settling without weight or sound over the grounds that were hers. On the desk beside them, closed, her father's ledger rested. Its figures were sound, and its work for now was done. Thank you for staying until the end. If this story stayed with you, leave a word in the comments, and we will see you at the next one.